about 10,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier along the cold, rushing rivers of what is now the Pacific Northwest of North America, a group of hunter-gatherers stood on the rocky bank and watched the water turn silver. Thousands upon thousands of large fish were fighting their way upstream against the current, leaping over rocks and waterfalls with astonishing power. These were Pacific salmon returning from the ocean to the exact streams where they had been born years before. Driven by an instinct older than any human memory, one of the hunters stepped carefully into the shallow water, spear in hand, and struck. The fish thrashed violently, its silver body flashing in the sunlight, until it was pulled ashore. When they cut it open, they found it full of rich, oily flesh, unlike anything else the forest or the sea had offered them that season. Thus began, in moments of pure observation and necessity repeated across countless generations, humanity's deep and enduring relationship with salmon, not through a sudden invention, but through patient learning of a creature that lived in two worlds at once, the fresh water of rivers and the salt water of the open ocean. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples of the North Pacific Rim, from Alaska down through British Columbia and into the Columbia River basin, built entire cultures around the annual salmon runs. The fish were not merely food. They were the foundation of wealth, ceremony, trade, and survival. Tribes developed sophisticated systems of weirs, traps, and nets that allowed them to harvest large numbers, while still leaving enough fish to reach the spawning grounds. They dried, smoked, and preserved the flesh so it could last through the long winters. Some mixed it with berries and fat to create dense, portable energy stores similar to pemmican. The first fish of the season was often greeted with ritual and respect, a recognition that the river's gift was not infinite and had to be treated with care. Archaeological evidence now shows that humans were already catching and cooking salmon in Central Alaska more than 11,500 years ago, one of the earliest confirmed uses of anadromous fish in North America. When European explorers and settlers arrived centuries later, they were stunned by the abundance. Early accounts described rivers so thick with salmon that a person could almost walk across their backs. But the newcomers saw the fish not as a sacred cycle to be managed, but as a resource to be extracted as quickly and completely as possible. By the mid-19th century, commercial canneries began appearing along the Columbia River and other major salmon rivers. In 1866, the first major cannery opened. Within 2 decades, there were dozens. Industrial nets, fish wheels, and traps intercepted the fish on their upstream journey in quantities that indigenous harvesters had never approached. The canning industry turned salmon into a global commodity, shipped in tins across oceans, but it also began the long, steep decline of the wild runs. As the Great Migrations weakened, people turned to a new idea: artificial propagation. Hatcheries were built in the hope that humans could simply replace what they had taken. Eggs were collected, fertilized, and raised in controlled conditions before the young fish were released back into the rivers. For a time, the method seemed promising, and many believed technology had solved the problem of scarcity, yet the hatcheries could not fully restore the complex genetic diversity and precise timing of wild populations. Dams, pollution, habitat destruction, and continued heavy fishing continued to push many stocks toward collapse. The true industrial transformation of salmon came not from trying to save the wild fish, but from learning to grow them entirely under human control. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, on the cold, sheltered coasts of Norway, a handful of fishermen and farmers began experimenting with floating sea pens. Brothers Over and Sivert Grundtvedt are often credited with one of the first successful large-scale trials on the island of Hitra in 1970. They placed young Atlantic salmon in simple cages made of wood, styrofoam, and nets, and watched them grow in the open sea. What began as a small, almost backyard experiment rapidly became an industry. Norwegian scientists, building on earlier European work with trout, developed systematic breeding programs. Within a few decades, Norway had turned salmon farming into a highly efficient, technology-driven enterprise. The model spread. Chile, with its long fjord-like coastline and opposite seasons, became the second great center of production. By the 1980s and 1990s, farmed salmon had overtaken wild catches as the main source of salmon on the global market. What had once been a seasonal, regional delicacy available only in certain places at certain times of year was now available year-round in supermarkets across the planet. The fish that had once required a dangerous journey from river to ocean and back could now be raised in controlled pens, fed formulated pellets, and harvested on a precise schedule. Today, the global salmon industry is worth many billions of dollars. Norway and Chile dominate production, but farming has expanded to Scotland, Canada, the Faroe Islands, and beyond. Consumers in countries that never had wild salmon runs now eat the fish regularly, drawn by its rich flavor and reputation as a healthy source of omega-3 fats. Yet this extraordinary commercial success has come with serious biological and ecological costs. Farmed salmon live in crowded conditions that can amplify disease and parasites such as sea lice. Escaped fish interbreed with wild populations, potentially weakening their genetic fitness. The industry requires large quantities of wild-caught fish to produce feed, raising questions about whether farming truly reduces pressure on the oceans. And the narrow genetic base of many commercial strains echoes the vulnerability seen in other intensively selected crops and animals throughout history. Scientists and managers continue to search for better ways forward, improved breeding for disease resistance, closed containment systems that reduce environmental impact, and renewed efforts to protect and restore the remaining wild runs. But the fundamental tension remains the same, one that has shaped the story of salmon for 10,000 years. A creature of astonishing natural abundance and complexity that humans have repeatedly tried to control, harvest and remake in their own image. From that ancient moment when a hunter first pulled a silver fish from a cold river, through the canneries of the Columbia, the experimental pens of Hitra, and the vast floating farms of Chile and Norway, the salmon's journey is one of the longest and most complicated partnerships between humans and any wild animal. It is a story of deep cultural reverence, industrial ambition, scientific ingenuity, and the persistent difficulty of living sustainably with a species that still, in its wild form, insists on completing a migration older than civilization itself.